Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for July 21st through the 27th, 2024. Just as a brief note, this is going to be part 1 of 2. I am going to separate this out into two separate videos, simply because I think that it's going to run a little bit too long, and the second part is going to cover an incident that I know that a lot of people are not interested in. This first part will be the standard Intel update, weekly news roll-up sort of thing. The second part is going to go a little bit deeper into one of the events that occurred this week, the Russian-Chinese joint exercise off the coast of Alaska. So, let's go ahead and get right to it with a standard brief, and just note that if you want to check out part 2, that will be coming out at the same time as this video. So for those of you who are interested, you can check that out as well. But starting off with the Northeast region, it has been a very busy week in American politics. Really, there are so many events that have occurred this week in, the political sphere that I don't necessarily want to cover them too much. I do want to mention the resignation of the U.S. Secret Service Director. She resigned this week, effective sometime in the future. I don't know how that's going to affect the investigation or the congressional hearing, congressional inquiry, whatever. But that may be a factor moving on into the future. Speaking of the investigation, there have been a lot of sort of leaks / disclosures / releases from Congress, from senators and congressmen who are sort of invested in this investigation process. And let's just say there are a lot of discrepancies that are mounting. I think that at this point, it wouldn't be controversial to say that the discrepancies and the sketchy details that have stacked up, the number of sketchy details that have stacked up from this investigation far outweigh the JFK assassination. So I think that a lot of this is going to work its way out over the next few weeks, and we're going to find out a lot of details that may be very shocking for us to learn. So that may be important to consider, especially when you have seemingly unrelated events that are absolutely, definitely related to the assassination attempt, such as Biden withdrawing from the presidential race. Again, I don't think anyone believes that Biden would have dropped out unless the assassination attempt failed. If the assassination attempt had succeeded, whether Biden had anything personally to do with it or not, that's not what I'm debating here. I think that if the assassination attempt had been a success, Biden would not have dropped out. They would have wheeled him out there and, just pushed forward until November. There would be no reason for, Biden to step down, because his candidate would have been eliminated from the running, his most serious political enemy, right? And that, again, goes back to the sort of assassination attempt. I think that we're seeing right now a lot of this unrest, a lot of this uncertainty, a lot of this sort of claws out kind of behavior from politicians is because the assassination attempt failed. If it had been a success as it was planned, I think the outcome would be very different. I think every politician in D.C. would be having a different attitude, right? So again, I think that the fallout from that is something to consider moving forward. There are two very, very different ideas as to why this unrest occurs. The first one is the most nefarious reason, and it's basically that the reason that you see this panic amongst the DC elite is because they planned the assassination, it failed, just by the skin of their teeth they failed at this operation, and now we're seeing the fallout effects from that. That's the more nefarious theory, right? No evidence. Well, okay, there's some evidence, but not like anything definitive right now that suggests the names of anyone who may have planned this, or even if it was a more substantial operation. That's the more nefarious theory at the moment. The other more benign theory is that a lot of politicians around DC are probably panicking right now because now they have their political rival achieving near martyrdom status without actually having to go the full distance, right? You can't come much closer to death than Trump did during this incident. And, now the DC elites know that there is absolutely zero chance that Donald Trump will legitimately lose the election. There's a zero chance of that. The only way that Donald Trump would lose the election now is if some discrepancies took place, if you know what I mean. But anyway, those are the two main theories. It's important to attribute actions to one or the other and do this correctly as you look at some of these political events. I think that a lot of politicians in D.C. are horrible people, but they didn't necessarily have a hand in this event. However, some people are a little bit more questionable, right? Either way, this will be debated for many millennia to come. So let's just understand that right now it's a little too hot. It's a little bit too kinetic right now. So let's just observe for a moment. Let's observe over the next few weeks and see how this all works out. Switching gears quite significantly, let's talk about an event that I did not mention in this week's Wire Reports, and this was the intentional derailment of a BNSF train in Bennett, Nebraska, just outside Lincoln. This was a somewhat minor incident. It wasn't a major train derailment. All the cars remained upright, thankfully. However, this one was an intentional act, as essentially immediately found out by authorities. We don't have a whole lot of details on this incident because it was conducted by a minor. A 17-year-old conducted this attack in order to generate content for YouTube. So again, not exactly a sort of traditional terror threat sort of thing. However, the details of this incident are absolutely another reminder for those in the more critical infrastructure-based professions to please be aware. Again, the details of this are sort of sketchy at the moment. However, local news has reported that the engineer was able to sort of avert much disaster because he noticed that a switch in the yard had been flipped the wrong way. So he hit the emergency brakes and was able to kind of save it as best he could. His locomotive still slammed into the back of another standing car on one of the tracks that he wasn't, again, supposed to be on. But one of the things that the investigators noticed immediately was, well, first of all, this guy sort of stayed around and he knew a little bit too much about how rail worked. So they were kind of suspicious about that, for one. Also, the video was uploaded to YouTube basically immediately. And when they looked at the security tapes, they found his vehicle driving by before the incident, and they found his tripod, his camera tripod, just kind of perched there, pointing towards the incident location a few minutes before the derailment took place. So again, this is another reminder that even though you may not see this traditionally, and it may be sort of rare for people to kind of try to get, clout by destroying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of critical infrastructure, it still may happen. There's still a lot of crazy people out there. There's still a lot of, attention-seeking behavior going on in society. It's not just like a jihadi threat or like a, cartel threat. Things are getting pretty serious in all regards. So again, I thought this incident was interesting enough to mention in the context of reminding everyone to just be vigilant, pay attention, and be on the lookout for things that aren't quite in the right spot. Moving down to the Southwestern Region, there have been a few incidents this week. Really, I just wanted to focus on the one that was probably we're probably going to get the fewest details about, and that was the arrest of a couple of high-value individuals from the Sinaloa cartel. There has been a lot of moving and shaking in the Sinaloa over the past few weeks and years, I guess. However, this one was kind of an interesting incident because it may, and I don't know if this is a psyop on the part of like the DEA or anybody, but it may signal a more substantial power play within the Sinaloa. And here's what I mean. Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, one of the senior members of the Sinaloa cartel, some media sources claim that he was one of the founding members of the Sinaloa. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think he was with the Juarez guys for a while, but in his early days. But anyway, he was a very high-ranking Sinaloa cartel member, along with Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the sons of El Chapo. Both of these guys got wrapped up in an operation. Basically, they were El Mayo got on a small aircraft, thought he was going to fly out to a more remote airfield, but the pilot was one of our guys, and instead of flying to a remote, drug trafficking dirt runway, somewhere in Mexico, he flew over the border into El Paso. So again, not really a trick that's going to be used more than once, because every cartel in South and Central America has picked up on that now. So it was kind of like a one-shot deal for the DEA. However, I thought it was interesting because a lot of media articles citing, of course, unnamed officials state that the reason that this happened is because one of the Sinaloa cartel members, an unnamed senior executive or whatever within this cartel, tricked El Mayo into getting on the plane. Like, hey, go ahead, I'll meet you there, sort of thing. And he may have done so, and I think the reason they put this in there is for two reasons. One, because there's fractures within the Sinaloa, which is interesting for an election year and interesting considering Mexico's new president. But also, I think this may also be a psyop to get the cartel leadership to think, well, who's the traitor in our midst when there is no traitor? They've been using this for a long time, so I don't know. Who knows? There have been power struggles. It's like the world's most, tangled web of soap opera relationships down in South and Central America. So it would take years to kind of explain all of this. But just for the average taxpayer out there, this may mean you see some pretty spicy activity along the border. We're already seeing cartels starting to use tactics that they're learning from Ukraine or from videos from Ukraine. So my guess is that this will probably result in some more kinetic activity along the border. You may have some soldiers down there get shot at a little bit more. So especially if they're in like a hot spot or a known area where the terrain allows that sort of activity to be more effective. In any case, this might trigger a little bit more substantial kinetic activities in the region over the next few weeks. Moving over to Western Europe, as many of you know, there have been several incidents occurring in France as the Olympics begin, most notably of which was the attack on the morning of the Olympic Games opening. There was a coordinated attack on several rail line logistical hubs throughout the region, really, as the Olympics began. Now, very little information has been released on this, and as of yet, no group has claimed responsibility for this, which is interesting because if we go to the most likely suspects, right, if we go to the usual guys, it's either the eco-terrorist organizations like Just Stop Oil or something like that. They haven't claimed it. The other jihadi groups that are kind of popular in the Paris, area, they haven't claimed it either. So I don't know if anyone knows who this is. There haven't been any major counterterrorism raids in response to this. So France, the French authorities haven't even really figured it out either, clearly. So, I don't know. It seems kind of sketchy. Now, I should say that even though this is a complex, coordinated, insurgent type activity, right? It's a coordinated sabotage attack. It wasn't particularly complex. Like it may fit the definition of being such, but essentially the nut and bolts of this attack were that someone just set some cables on fire at several hubs, cables that the trains use for either power, communications, or whatever. So they're not exactly hidden. You can get to them fairly easily. They're easily accessible because they need to be accessible for maintenance. So it's not something that's particularly hard to do. So it's not like a many months worth of preparation went into this. You could probably plan this for a couple of weeks, and that's probably what they did, just planned it a couple of weeks ago. But again, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say who the culprit was from this. It probably doesn't matter, honestly, at the end of the day. Because even if the French told us who was responsible, would anybody believe them? I mean, really hard to say. But anyway, kinetic things happening in Paris. Very, very tumultuous time throughout Western Europe. Speaking of the rest of Western Europe, I just wanted to highlight this for a more American audience, to maybe pay a little bit more attention to this, because the issues that our friends across the pond are dealing with are very similar to what we may face in like major cities around the United States. So one thing that has really sort of come to a head and has started to affect day-to-day life in a lot of the United Kingdom and Ireland, even Northern Ireland, is the immigration issues. So in Coolock in Ireland, there have been basically riots, demonstrations, unrest just generally over the past few months. Every time I write about an arson attack that has occurred there, it's, there's another one that's occurred. So the locals there, Coolock has been selected to house a migrant welcome center. That's what they're getting away with calling their sort of locations by which immigrants can be, pumped into the local area and just stay there and destroy things, right? So it's like quite literally like a government-sanctioned invasion of a local area, especially smaller towns. Well, the locals in Coolock have been fighting, quite like literally fighting this for weeks now. They've burned down the potential migrant center, I don't know, a dozen times at least by now. They've destroyed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of construction equipment. Now we're starting to see, at least in Northern Ireland, we're starting to see, which is kind of telling, some more kinetic threats being made with regards to direct threats against construction workers who are working on these projects. Now, I did highlight this a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago now, gosh, where construction workers, where locals were convincing peacefully construction workers to walk away from the job because this is not what Ireland is, and so on and so forth. It seems, though, that as we all know, there's always someone willing to make a buck. So it seems like a lot of the localities in Ireland, even as far away as Dublin, right, are starting to become more kinetic in their resistance efforts. And, of course, the Irish authorities are cracking down like you would not believe on this sort of thing. So, again, lots of unrest throughout Ireland, and very similar sort of thing happening in the UK. There have been, every few weeks in the UK, there's some major incident, usually a stabbing attack. Now, again, in the UK, there are random stabbing attacks generally every day. However, every couple of weeks or so, one of the terrorists or jihadis or immigrants, they're almost always migrants committing these stabbings. And they'll stumble upon a high-value target. A few days ago, it was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army was stabbed, and that sort of led to a whole sort of unrest because the police cracked down rather heavily on migrants in response. In the days after this, they were on kind of like a high alert. Got a little bit rough with a lot of migrants that they're trying to stop from being degenerate sort of thing, and the crackdown results in even more bad behavior. So the reason that I mention this is because it's very hard to explain this to an American audience who may be familiar with illegal immigrants that are from, say, South and Central America. I mean, I grew up in tobacco country America, so I have seen the worst parts that immigration can bring to this country. I grew up with it, right? It's not exactly something that you want to talk about at the dinner table sort of thing. But what's going on in Western Europe, particularly the UK, London, right? This is nothing short of a quite literal invasion. It checks all the boxes. If we were to, break out our sort of, warfare doctrine sort of stuff, it really does check all the boxes for a military operation taking place. The only difference being is that the weapons they get, they find them there. So I think this is going to happen. This is going to be a problem for the UK for a very long time, especially now their new Prime Minister has basically put the pedal to the metal with supporting this kind of behavior. It's just like accelerating. And this is not good. So for the American taxpayer, it would be wise to kind of look at this and understand that, well, maybe not the exact same thing is going to happen, because essentially the migrants that are landing in the UK are very different from the ones we're getting. However, it really does just highlight the big data concerns of, well, what happens when you take a city of 30,000 people and you put 20,000 illegals in it from another country who don't speak the language, who were incarcerated in the nation they came from, and they literally state that they're going to, commit very horrendous, large-scale crimes. What happens when that, takes effect? Well, We see similar efforts, maybe not as dire, but we see similar efforts being undertaken here in the United States. Even just a few towns in my somewhat local area, a few hours away, we're definitely seeing this, and the culture clashes are resulting in some very serious behavior. So again, something to keep in mind, especially considering that the next few years, whatever happens in the United States this election season is going to have a direct impact on Europe and so on and so forth. Moving on to the Red Sea, Horn of Africa region, just briefly wanted to mention the merchant vessel Pumbaa surviving several attacks, actually, because the embarked security team was able to shoot at the Houthi drone boat, the unmanned surface vessel, and they were able to detonate that prematurely. So good on the crew and the security team on board the merchant vessel Pumbaa. They probably saved a lot of lives for sure. As far as a lot of the other vessels that we've just kind of been mentioning and then forgetting, I haven't forgotten them. It's just really hard to get information on these vessels for two reasons. One, it's largely private data and proprietary, so you're going to have to pay a few $1,000s to get a report from some think tank that talks about maritime security, or, which is the more likely one, insurance. These companies don't want to let on how bad the damage is, because there may be a line item in their insurance policy that prevents them from discussing this so that the insurgents and the Houthis don't realize how much damage they did and then try the same attack again. There's a lot of OPSEC going on here, in which case these maritime companies, if they get hit with ammunition, they don't want to say how bad it is, because they don't want to let the Houthis know okay, we'll now aim for this spot. Regardless, I think the Houthis know pretty well how effective their targeting is, but in any case, that's why we can't get a lot of information a lot of times on some of these vessels. Now, switching over to the South China Sea, again, I will skip this slide, and this will be an entirely separate video here in just a moment, but I did want to briefly mention the joint Chinese-Russian drill, or actually technically multiple exercises that have occurred over the past few weeks in the South China Sea, the Northern Pacific, the Bering Sea, all over the place, right? So one of the major sort of considerations for the American taxpayer is that China has now expressed the desire to work more closely with Russia with regards to military exercises. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that China and Russia are BFFs. No, China and Russia have some very serious diplomatic tensions between their nations. However, we also have to realize that China and Russia are actually, they're taking efforts to bridge the gaps between their nations, and they're taking measures to sort of move together and try to improve relations. Again, really just because there's the common enemy between them, the United States. So, that seems to be a fairly common motivating factor for them. Again, it does not mean that they're on like absolutely perfect, diplomatic terms. And it's always challenging in the West to see if we're looking at things through the correct lens, because, again, we don't want to just take in, classic American NATO, war college propaganda, which tells you, oh, Russia and China hate each other. Well, that's not an accurate representation of the situation. It's complicated, right? Russia and China will cooperate on some things and then not on others, and then there's kind of a cool relationship, a little bit of a tepid situation over here, and then over there it's fine. Really the thing that kind of interested me is the military cooperation. So I'll talk about that bomber flight and those exercises here in just a moment. Wrapping things up today with the intercepted GhostNet reports. I got a lot of reports this week that I didn't quite understand. I got really good propagation this week. I don't know if anybody else did really, really well, but I was able to receive a lot of traffic. So here are the reports that I got. Some of them they're partial reports from a long way away. So you can kind of read them and sort of make of them what you will. I don't know what to make of them, but again, there's enough there to Google. One that I did want to highlight is this report right here, which is someone sending a message to another station that I could not hear. So a station sent a message that I could not hear, but I could hear another person's radio replying to them. So I heard the message that they sent to that call sign. I heard that message, and they said, I saw your check-in with Montana weather status. So clearly the person who was sending that was in Montana. That's out of the range of me. But this does highlight the store and forward sort of capabilities of JS8 calls. So if I wanted to talk to that person, I could hear the person who responded to them, who was probably in the West somewhere. I didn't look up where they're from, but I could have pinged this person and sent a message through them. I could have relayed a message to the guy in Montana. And I think that would have been a pretty effective way to do that, even though I did not hear him at first. So that's just something to keep in mind is, if you hear a station that's, kind of far away, maybe try a relay, who knows. There's a lot of other more complicated things you can do with this HF radio stuff. I know that it's over the head of most people that are probably watching. However, in due time, this will get a lot simpler, right? This will get a lot easier to do. So, again, there we go. Lots of good reports for this week. And here are the sources for this. I'm going to talk about these as well in the part 2 that's coming out here in just a moment. But yeah, that's all I have for part 1. Make sure to stick around for part 2, which will be dropping at the same time as this, hopefully. Maybe a little bit later. But I'm going to be putting that out as fast as I possibly can. But for those of you who just wanted the news, here you go. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.